The year 1763. Great Britain had just won the 7-year war against France, which was a great success, but also landed them in $60 million of debt. So they needed a way out, and what do? They decided to start taxing their colonies. Not the best idea, because this is what sparked the American Revolution. First introduced in 1764 was the Sugar Act, enforcing all the colonies to import sugar and molasses strictly from Great Britain. A year later, the Stamp Act was introduced, which started taxing the colonies on paper, newspapers, playing cards, legal documents, and dice. Of course, at the time, the colonies were also quite upset because they had no representation in the parliament that was levying taxes on them. And so the protests started. Protesters started to boycott British goods, and eventually this started hurting British business, and they eventually had to repeal the Stamp Act. Still in a lot of debt. So what do? They start taxing their colony, and they boycotted British goods once again. Finally, the British had repealed all taxes on all goods, except for the ones on tea, which will be an important footnote for later. Also, 1,000 troops were sent to Boston to keep an eye on things. And so March 5th of 1770 rolled around. Protesters started gathering and decided to start throwing snowballs, which turned into stones, which turned into sticks and rocks at British troops, which fired upon 5 civilians, killing them. This was known as the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre only fueled the burning fire. I can't do British accents, but it's December 16th, March 1773, and I think it's a perfect day for a Boston Tea Party. This is my personal favorite protest that I learned about, and on this treacherous day, more than 10,000 pounds of tea were thrown in the ocean, or about $1 million worth of tea because of the taxes that were still being imposed on them. The British were worried and sent over 3,000 troops over. Colonies saw this and worried that they were going to be next, and all decided to hold the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. All the big names were there. John Adams and John Jay, George Washington, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, John Dickinson. Other names soon joined after the First Continental Congress as well. You will surely recognize these names. Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson, otherwise known as the Founding Fathers. They convened to make a response to the fighting that was happening in 1775. Notably, the Battle of Lexington and Concord was started a little like this. The British decided to attack during the middle of the night, and patriots like Paul Revere rode forward to warn the rebels that the British were coming, giving them time to prepare. Both sides eventually met in Lexington, and after an awkward standoff, someone shot first, marking the start of the American War of Independence, otherwise known as the shot heard around the world. First, it seemed that the Americans were going to lose. Eventually, more rebels joined the cause, and they managed to push back the British, forcing them to retreat. Back to the story. Although the Continental Congress is probably most known for the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, with one of the more famous lines being, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Even though, come on, that makes no sense, because at the time, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, women couldn't vote, and even if you were a white guy with not enough property, you still didn't have the right to vote. Although the idea that everyone was equal was radical for the time. Eventually, the Constitution found its way set in place July 4th, 1776, known as the greatest day in American history. After everything was said and done, the Americans finally saw themselves as independent from the British, although the British did not see it the same way they did, and they continued to fight many battles up until 1781, a few of which being Valley Forge, Siege of Yorktown, Battle of Cowpens, and the Battle of Saratoga, just to name a few. In 1783, it finally looked like the American Revolution was coming to a close when the treaty was signed in Paris, which recognized Americans' independence and their borders. More importantly, they replaced their monarch with an elected president, with an elected parliament, with an elected Congress. Second, the Declaration of Independence said in it that the government had no right to tax, which meant that if you had property, you weren't being taxed on it. And if you had a lot of property, you could keep it. And a lot of the people who signed on with this were rich people with a lot of property. And they now also recognize the rights for widows and daughters to inherit property. Most importantly, the Americans finally had their independence. I mean, come on, it was such a great place now. America! What could ever go wrong? Everyone was happy. What civil war could ever start here, right?